Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar on how to have difficult conversations. My name is Shannon Wolf, and I'm the Managing Director and Chief of Staff of AAUW, and I have the real pleasure of working with the National Inclusion and Equity Committee on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Toolkit that contains a lot of great information and also includes some information on how to have difficult conversations. So that's going to be our topic for today, and I'm really, really pleased to introduce you to two of our wonderful panelists. First, we have Jessie Orenberger. Jessie is a member of our National Inclusion and Equity Committee. She's a national AAUW member, and she's a longtime presenter of our Work Smart and Start Smart workshops in the Boston area. So welcome, Jessie, and thank you for being here today. I really appreciate it. We also have Edwina Sessions. Edwina is a longtime AUW member in New Jersey and the former president of the Willingboro, New Jersey branch. And she's also the state diversity chair for New Jersey. And so we're thrilled to have you, Edwina, here today. So thank you for joining us as well. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of our format today, Jessie's going to take you through some of the great content we have on our toolkit. I'm actually going to put the link to that toolkit in the chat in just a few minutes so you can follow along and check out all of the great resources that we have there. And then Edwina and Jessie are going to have a great conversation about how to have difficult conversations. Edwina has done one of these sessions at her branch, and I think it'll be a great learning opportunity for all of us to hear about, to hear their conversation today. And at the end, we will save some time for some Q&A. And with that, I'm going to move over to Jessie to get started with our presentation. Jessie?
Thanks so much, Shannon. So for this webinar, as Shannon said, we'll start by going through some of the resources from the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Toolkit that specifically address getting started with difficult conversations. Then we'll view a short video giving some examples of responses and reactions to microaggressions. And then Edwina and I will have a conversation about her successful workshop on difficult conversations about race that she had at her branch. From the homepage of the toolkit homepage, you can click on Getting Started with Difficult Conversations to access the resources that I'm going to talk about. Next slide, please. This is just the top of the Difficult Conversations page. And I wanted to just address first, so why are we having difficult conversations? Or rather, why are our conversations difficult? And just some things that might come up. Issues of discrimination and bias and injustice bring with them strong emotions. As people learn about the lived realities of other people, they might feel feelings of guilt or anger or sadness, strong emotions. And people can feel uncomfortable raising issues with folks that they don't know. Not everyone is best friends with everyone else at their branch. And so having these difficult conversations with folks that you don't know can make them that much more challenging. People might not know where to start having these conversations. They might be afraid that they say the wrong thing. They might be afraid that they might be tokenized or overwhelmed or traumatized. So it's important to really think about how to begin. Next slide, please. The resources on the toolkit, we have a How to Begin section. And the resources provided here are helpful for both planned and impromptu conversations that you might be having. We want the conversations that you're having within your branch to be productive, respectful, and helpful. So thinking about the goals of the conversation, what the structure of these conversations might be, and what the current culture of your group is, will help you navigate running a workshop on difficult conversations and then further conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide, please. So setting some ground rules for your conversations within your branch or within each conversation that you have is a great first step. Facilitating these conversations, as I mentioned, might bring up some discomfort or disagreement between members. And as a facilitator, if you're facilitating a conversation, setting ground rules is important, but also as members participating, setting ground rules that everyone feels comfortable is important. Being uncomfortable doesn't mean being unsafe. And so ground rules can help make sure that people are digging into a topic and learning without causing harm to other people. We have some suggested ground rules, as you can see on the screen. This is pulled right from the toolkit. But you may want to have a discussion with the folks around you to establish additional ground rules that you feel are important. Under the suggested ground rules on our site, we link to an infographic on conversation ground rules that you might find helpful to print out or even distribute within your branch. Next slide, please. Community agreements are similar, and we have some guidelines on the page around community agreements as well. Community agreements and ground rules may overlap some, but it's a good idea when you're starting your conversations to actually bring out a large piece of paper or write on a whiteboard or chalkboard what your community agreements will be. These are rules for the conversation, and it's important to seek input from the group. Again, we have a list of suggested community agreements. Next slide, please. Here are some of those suggested community agreements, and some of them are, quite simple as speaking from an I perspective and listening actively to hear what the folks around you are saying. If you are usually the person that speaks up, taking the time to give space to other folks who might not speak as much. Don't force others to speak. Respect silence. If someone needs to take a breath, let them. Share, even if you're not sure what the right words are. Uphold confidentiality. So anything that's said in the session, it's important to treat it as such. And lean into discomfort. So as these uncomfortable conversations may arise, if you feel on edge, try to really think about taking a deep breath and digging into that for yourself. Next slide, please. Finally, the last part on the toolkit around difficult conversations is about managing conflict. Managing conflict can help you to understand how you approach conflict, how you approach uncomfortable situations, understanding how you yourself might react or do typically tend to react to situations of discomfort. It can help you to manage conflict both for yourself, but also with conversations that you're having with others. Next slide, please. In addition to this infographic, we list numerous resources for conflict management toward the bottom of the toolkit page. So I would recommend looking at those both to understand yourself, but also how, if you are facilitating a conversation, how you might deal with folks who are having trouble discussing with each other. We're going to switch gears now. So that is the toolkit portion. We're going to switch gears and watch a short video about responding to microaggressions. The video is about responding to microaggressions at work, but I really do think that it applies to all contexts. So I can pull up the video if needed. Just let me know, Nisha. The video, it's about 10 minutes, and it's about these two women are going to have a conversation about responding to microaggressions and discuss some words that you can put in your own toolkit to respond to folks when they maybe say something that is offensive to you, or if you yourself have accidentally said something that is offensive to someone else and you have caused harm. So let's take a minute to watch this video.
Comment, right? So let's say I'm just going to play the microaggressor in this example. Let's say I say to you, Felicia, wow, you're like really smart and like good at tech for a biracial woman. Total bad microaggression. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so if I were to choose to respond, I would say there's a couple ways I could respond. One way would be, just off the top of my head, Hey, Lauren, thank you so much for that statement, but it actually came across as a little bit offensive and a bit of a microaggression for me. And if you're willing to talk about it further, I'd love to have a discussion to talk about why that statement can be a microaggression versus a compliment, which is what I think you meant when you initially shared that with me. So that's one way. I could also respond and say, hey, Lauren, I actually want to talk a little bit more about, why you said that, because I would like to think that I'm really smart and successful in my career because of my skills and my education, not because of my biracial identity or, the color of my skin. So, can we have a little bit more of a conversation around that? I could also just say, hey, that was a microaggression. Here's some articles. Go read some more on your own. That's probably not going to be, you probably would find that last approach a little bit more, abrupt, perhaps. But there's a million ways to respond. What I have found personally really effective has been, again, to try and separate it from me saying, hey, Lauren, you're being offensive to me, and focusing more on the, hey, Lauren, these words are a microaggression, or this language is not the language. And so that separates a little bit, it creates a little bit of space there. So if you're on the receiving end of this discussion, hopefully you're not thinking, she's attacking me. It's not about an attack or not. It's really about how do we have dialogue with each other. Right. And again, that's where it gets complicated, because sometimes what is done or said is so offensive that maybe that's not really what we want to do. We may not want to have dialogue. We may want to shut down the action or behavior. If you are walking down the street and you see, a group of white people beating up a black person, you don't want to have a dialogue and say, hey, this is offensive.
Time out. Yeah.
Not the approach, right? And so it's going to require a different way of being in that space. And I think we're seeing a lot of this, and allyship, you mentioned it, it's very closely tied up into a lot of this. We're seeing a lot of allyship in action with these recent emergence of all these protests, where we're seeing, and I'm going to bring it back to racial sort of interactions, where we're seeing white people put their bodies in front of black people because they have that privilege, and they know that the police may not be as quick to, beat someone up who's white versus someone who's a black protester. And so that's one way of sort of addressing that macroaggression, really, not so much microaggression. But there's also a lot of things to be thinking of if you're the person who committed the microaggression. And what I like to say is that if someone comes to you and shares that what you did or what you said or how you acted was a microaggression, it can be really hard to take that information in, because I think that for most of us, at the core of who we are, we want to be good people and we see ourselves as good people. And when someone shares something like this, the immediate kind of mental place that we go to, and I'm saying this because I've been there too, is we're like, oh, I'm a terrible person. And, I'm not a terrible person. So let me be really defensive and push back on you. And so there's that immediate, defensiveness that tends to come up a lot when someone is trying to enter into a dialogue around what's going on. And it's hard because we all make mistakes. We're human beings. And so it's just part of how we act and how we show up as humans. We're all going to make mistakes. No one is perfect. Yeah. But it's really about what do you do once you've been made aware that there is a failure or there's a mistake or something has happened. Yeah. And how I like to think about it is that if someone shares with me how they were offended by a microaggression, it's basically a gift of communication that they're sharing with me. And if I am trying to be anti-racist, if I'm trying to better myself, if I'm trying to be in this work, I have to take these moments as learning opportunities and areas for growth, and not look at it as, oh, I fell down and now I'm a horrible person. And I've made mistakes and I'm in this work very deeply. And it's really about how do I grow from that? Mm-hmm. And so a critical first step, if you're the person who's on this committing side of the equation, is to apologize and listen. Yeah. And that sounds very simple, but it is very hard to do.
And so many people, I feel like now too, are trying not to say sorry because we've done the whole thing about don't over apologize. This is the time to apologize, you guys. Sorry when you're trying to say excuse me is different than I'm sorry I hurt your feel, or I'm sorry I did that.
Or it's a difference between saying like, oh, I'm sorry you feel that way.
Yeah.
Puts it back on the person like, oh, it's your issue, and saying, I'm sorry. Are you in a space where you can share more? And part of that apology is really acknowledging the other person's reality. And this is where it gets very difficult, because one of the things I also talk a lot about is how, Lauren, your experience, your lived experience, your identities, your background, all of the things that make you who you are at this moment in time, and that lens that you're viewing the world through can be really different and actually completely in opposition to my lens and how I view the world. And so really the work is, how do we hold both of these truths as truths at the same time when they're not the same?
Yeah.
And that's very difficult to do. It's something that is a skill you have to work at really hard. And so, I've been in positions where I've looked at a situation and I'm thinking, big deal, whatever. But someone else is looking at it and experiencing it in a really different way. And so I really have to make sure that I'm remembering that even though I may not be experiencing something, I have certain identities, but I may not share that experience. Or even if I had the same exact identity as someone else, they may be processing it in a very different way. Yes. And so how do you really make sure that you're acknowledging their experience, so that you're not just completely shutting them down? And part of the work too is taking ownership of your own awareness, your own understanding, your privileges, understanding where you have privilege, where you don't, where you may have these learned prejudices that we all carry within us. And again, just to say it one more time, intent does not equal impact. And so a lot of times our immediate reaction is we want to say, oh, I didn't mean it that way. Oh, I meant it as a compliment. Well, guess what? Maybe the person didn't receive it as a compliment.
Yeah.
They received it as something really,
and that matters. How they receive it matters. So my takeaways here on how to respond are, make it about the action, not about the person, and to use I statements versus you statements to help with that defensiveness. This is just, I'm going to, I guess, give my takeaways from the person who is receiving a microaggression, and then I'll do my takeaways for the person who is giving a microaggression.
No,
I love it. No, and this is, I think, helpful because you are the master, you are the teacher, and I want to make sure that I've got my takeaway. So for me to respond to a microaggressor, I might say, Felicia, I really enjoy working with you. This is a great project. In that meeting, there was a comment about the fact that I'm on this project because I'm a woman and we needed more women on the project, or whatever. I'm making this up as I go. That I perceive that as a microaggression because I believe that I'm on this project because of my skill set, not because I'm a woman. I wanted to bring that to your attention, or to your attention, that I perceive that as something that wasn't helpful and beneficial to our meeting. Did I pass?
Yes. And then if I was the person responding, the work here is to not say, oh, whatever, Lauren, or you're crazy, or you're just making it up in your head. The work is to say, thank you for sharing that with me. I appreciate, and I know that it may have been hard for you to do so. Let's maybe talk a little bit more about it. I want to share, my thought process behind that statement, but I also want to hear how I hear that it landed in a way that I did not intend. And so I want to make sure that I correct myself in the future. And so how do we?
Ooh, I like that. I like the, that landed differently than the intention. I like that. That's like a really good phrase of, in the meeting, this thing happened, or, this action occurred. So, I wanted to speak to you about this action that occurred. It didn't landed the way it was probably perceived, and giving somebody like kind of the benefit of the doubt that their intentions are good. Can we talk about how to do that differently in the future? Or can we talk about why that didn't land correctly? I like those. I like the.
Thanks for listening to these two women talk about how to respond to microaggressions. Hopefully you got some language that you can use the next time you are having a conversation, and you either commit a microaggression or you're on the receiving end of a microaggression. I think some of the language that they used was particularly helpful. I will put the link to the video in the chat so that if you would like to watch it again or review, because I did see a quick comment that it was going very fast, that they were talking fast. So I can share that with everyone. If you'd like to watch it again, the video started at the 28-minute mark, and we watched it for about 10 minutes. But the whole video is really good if you want to watch it. But now I'd like to switch gears and talk with Edwina. So Edwina, let's get back to our conversation.
Okay.
So Edwina successfully did a session called Guidelines for Having Difficult Conversations About Race with the New Jersey branch. And Edwina, I'm hoping that you could start by just walking us through that workshop.
Certainly. Thank you for having me. Well, earlier this year, I co-hosted a workshop on having difficult conversations with our program chair, Jackie McGinnis, and we talked about difficult conversations to our state meeting, to our New Jersey state meeting. At the beginning of the conversation, I started out with steps or guidelines to how to start a conversation.
Edwina, it sounds like something happened with your sound.
In talking to AAUW branches, I started with talking about approaching the conversation with respect. And by saying respect, I meant trying to make sure that everyone realizes and has respect for the pain and the oppression that racism causes. And the next thing you want to make sure you create an atmosphere that everyone is comfortable about the topic and everyone is relaxed. That means leaving all preconceptions aside, having a clear mind and being open-minded. Then you want to encourage people to be active listeners. Now, there are many kinds of listeners, but you want this group that you're talking to about conversations to listen to learn. There's so much to learn about racism. There's a lot of history about it. And the more that you learn about racism, the better you will be able to make a change. You have to embrace the subject. You have to internalize it. You have to take yourself to that world of racism and almost put yourself in that place and how you would feel being different. When you take yourself to that place, you're ready to make a commitment, because a commitment is required to making a change that everyone has to realize. If you commit yourself to change, you decide that you want to make a difference in the world and in the way people are being treated because of the color of their skin. Minorities can't change it by themselves. They need everyone. If you have ever witnessed someone being treated because they were different, then you will know just how degrading that can be. It takes ongoing conversations like we're having today. We've had to make a choice to make a change. You have to decide in your heart that you want to be a part of the change. And without a meaningful commitment to change, you're just putting a Band-Aid on an old wound. A good discussion to have is to listen to what other people have experienced. So during my workshop, I talked about a time when I entered an upscale department store and I was followed around by the store clerk. And then I talked about a time when I entered a place of business that was hiring until I walked in the door. And then suddenly they were not hiring anymore. So there are experiences that people can go on and on about regarding racism. But this is why it's so important to have these conversations. We all have to take responsibility for making a change.
Thank you, Edwina. If folks were thinking about doing another workshop or doing a similar workshop, or you were going to do this workshop again, what adjustments would you make to the workshop, if any?
Just to lengthen it, and to continuity is the key. So I would just keep having these conversations and just add on to it as you go along. That one was guidelines. I would add on remarks people make, microaggressions, how words matter. I would just keep going. The more you add to conversations about race, the better it is. And you just keep adding on.
I think we can take away from both your experience and what we saw in the video that we just watched that continued conversation and over again is definitely important. And what we are doing here with these workshops, we're just going to keep doing them and hopefully move the needle forward. So Edwina, if folks are interested in planning their own or facilitating their own type of this workshop, what recommendations do you have for them?
I would recommend that you get to know your branch members, because maybe everybody's not on board with this. Not that they don't see a need for it, but everybody is different and everybody may not be on board. And that will tell you where the work is needed, what you need to do in your branch. And I just want to talk about 4 different kinds of branch members that you may have.
Next slide, please.
Slide. And here, I'm going to show you a few pictures, and they're just visual scenarios that your meeting may look like during these conversations. Every branch has a leader. It's not always your president, but you always have leaders in your branch, and you know who they are. And that's the person who's ready to get on board with having these conversations, and they want everybody to join them. Next slide. And then you have the member who is very, very supportive, and you know who they are in your branch. And they're ready to do whatever needs to be done to have these conversations and to make the world a better place to live in. So they're going to support you. So you have them. You have the confidence that they're going to be right there to help you get started. Next slide. And then you have that enthusiastic member who's going to make sure everybody's on board. And they recognize that change is needed. They recognize the need for racism to be abolished. And they're ready to get on board. And they're going to be the ones asking, what do you want to do next? What's the first thing we can do? Next slide. You may have a few members, they see the need for having conversations about race, but they're just not sure if they're the one to do it. And this is the member that you have to work with, member or members that you have to work with. They may not be sure that they're the ones that can make a change. They'll need more encouragement. Maybe in a small group, take them aside one-on-one, but they're the ones you want to target to get on board with you about having conversations about race. But be interested in what people are thinking, because it's important. Be interested in what they're saying, and be interested in what your members are feeling. Because if they need a little more encouragement, it's okay. It's okay. Just be supportive. And just to summarize, we want to educate our members. We want to make sure that they know how harmful racism is. And also, we want to stay in line with our diversity statement, our mission for AAUW, and we want to make sure that everybody understands why it's important to have these conversations. You want your members to recognize any conscious biases they may have or any unconscious biases. Now's the time to get it out. You want to keep having these conversations for as long as necessary until you see that it's working. We're all responsible to make a change. And that's the motivation for having conversations about race, is to make a change.
Thank you, Edwina. That was all that we had to share, unless Edwina, you had something else that you'd like to add. I think we could take questions now.
Okay.
Great. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat here. I'd like to start with, would this conversation change if the participants are in different age groups? My branch has members average age of maybe 70, and this terminology may be unfamiliar to them. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you have to get to know your branch to think about where everybody is at. It might mean that you do some sharing and investigating of what terms folks don't know, so that you all can learn those terms together, or use alternative ways of describing things until everybody is on the same page. I think microaggressions are a term, I'm guessing, is maybe what this is referring to. But maybe folks don't know the term microaggression, but that might be something that you all investigate together, and that you use a different language to describe what a microaggression is. If somebody says a microaggression, they've said something offensive to you. So saying what you have said is bothering me, is offensive to me, and here's why. You don't need to use a term that might be unfamiliar to everybody. I think folks know when you say that was hurtful to me, or that bothered me, they know what you're talking about. So,
And I'd like to add, if I could.
Sure.
Call it out. Always call it out. Words matter, and words hurt. And what I often do is, if I hear something that's a remark that's made, and I'll say to the person, how would you feel if someone said that to you? I try to put it back on them, and I try to give them the benefit of the doubt. I try to give them a chance to change their remark. I might even say, is that what you really meant to say? And what message are you trying to say? Or what message do you want to give? But always call it out. Always bring it to their attention. I found it. That helps.
Yeah, I'd also like to weigh in and just say that there is a key terms and concepts section of the toolkit that is a really great resource. And I think a question just came into the chat about terminology, and that's a really great place to start. You could even start with that in your branch to say, do we all have these common understandings of what these words mean? Because not everybody does, and not everybody has had the experience or has done, as much work to sort of learn all of these terms, which frankly, a lot of them are fairly new in the last 10 to 20 years for mainstream sort of consumption. So I would really recommend that you look at those key terms and concepts within the toolkit. If they put that link in, it should be way at the top of the chat by now, but would recommend that you look there as well. Let's see here. What would you recommend if the microaggression happens in the context of a meeting where it could feel embarrassing to you or to the aggressor to address it sort of in a public place? What would you recommend in that scenario?
Whether you address something in the moment or later on is really up to, I think, your comfort level. And everybody's going to feel differently and may feel differently depending on where they are in this journey of learning as well. But as Edwina said, it does need to be addressed, and calling somebody out in the middle of a meeting might not be your style, and that's fine. But if you feel the need to say something, then you can approach that person after the meeting and say, let's talk about that. What happened in the meeting? Was bothersome, was offensive, etc. And I'd like to talk about how to do that differently next time so that we don't have another meeting like that. I think people's personal comfort levels really are going to come into play in how and when they address someone else and their interaction.
And addressing it later is fine because you don't want to escalate a situation. If anything, you want to de-escalate. You want to make it better. I think the person, if you pull them aside or later say something to them, I think they'll take it better. Because if you maybe put a person on the spot, they won't learn anything because it'll be angry. It'll turn into anger.
Right. And I think, that the embarrassment and the shame and the defensiveness is our first reaction. You saw in the video that the pushback is the first reaction. And if it's public, that's the tendency for that to happen is even more so. And so, if it's someone that you frequently interact with and want to get along with, then I think doing it outside of a public context can really be helpful to furthering the relationship and open conversation that you might have in the future with each other.
I would also add that, sometimes there's being the object of the microaggression, and then there's observing that when you're seeing that in a meeting, and both of those things can be difficult to address or in a public place of some kind. And the sort of bystander is also important in this scenario as well. If you see something in a meeting where you're saying, hey, that didn't land very well with me, it's not always on the person who that was addressed to address that. If you see something and you think that it's not right, you should say something as well. Because oftentimes these things fall to people of color, or people, or women, or whoever is the object of the microaggression. Sometimes it's exhausting to have to keep being the one who's like, no, you're offending me. Like, sometimes it's just easier to walk away. So if you're seeing that scenario happen in front of you to somebody else, it is important to address that, because that person may not, frankly, have the energy to do that day.
I think somebody had mentioned in the comments too about a lot of the work falling on folks of color, and I think that as bystanders and as allies, that is something that I think is really important, so that everyone is doing the work. And yes, it's not the person who is having the microaggression against them or the offensive behavior against them. It's not their responsibility to educate the offender. And it is a gift when they do. But if you're an observer of that, you can, you can step in and do some education yourself.
We have a question here that's kind of interesting. Is there a difference between calling out racism and calling out sexism? It feels like we'll get more pushback on calling out sexism, as if women are imagining things. Do you notice a difference?
That's an interesting question. I'm not positive how to answer that. I would imagine it depends on the context and the group of people that you're talking to, and the people's lived experiences that you're interacting with at the time. I'm not sure how. I don't think a blanket statement on one is easier to address than another. I think they're both difficult subjects. And when someone is being racist, when someone is being sexist, they are doing something that needs to be addressed and will probably be defensive regardless of their action. And so I think having in your toolkit phrases and things that you can say will help you feel more empowered to say something if that is something that you're able to do. But I'm not sure that there's like a blanket yes no answer to this.
I think one is just as offensive as the other. I think you want to you don't want to put them all in a box, but I think I think you call both of them out. You know, I think depending on the situation, they both need to be called out because we're trying to live in a diverse world now, and we're trying to be inclusive, and we cannot accomplish that if we're going to just let it go. So we're going to have to try. It's our responsibility to try to educate people, whether they want to be educated or not. We have to try. We have to reach out. I just want to talk about internalizing racism a little bit. If you have to internalize racism if you're going to make a commitment to change. If you don't have a mindset that racism is wrong, and I'm going to make a commitment to do something about it, to try to do my part about racism. If you don't do that, if you don't take it on and internalize it, it will not last. You can make up your mind on Monday that I am going to do something that's going to help this situation that we have in this country on racism. If you don't internalize it by Wednesday, you're back to your same way in 3 days. So you have to internalize it and make a choice that you're going to make a change.
What if the microaggression is made by your boss or supervisor or a person who has some power over you? Is this handled differently?
Yeah, I mean, power dynamics certainly will come into play, not just in a supervisor-employee situation, but in many contexts. I think that can come into play, and you need to feel safe if you're going to address the microaggression. And so, there's different avenues for how to do that. It depends on the relationship that you might have with your supervisor. Do you know that person is going to be receptive? How does that person like to be communicated with? Is this something that is happening on a frequent basis? Is this something that you need to enlist the help of others for? Maybe if you have a great relationship with your boss and they commit a microaggression against you, maybe you do feel comfortable saying, just wanted to address something that you said. It made me uncomfortable, and I know that that's not what you intended, but here's why, and here's what I would like to have happen in the future. But if you don't feel safe doing that, then there are other avenues, hopefully, at the organization where you could seek out the help of others, like HR or some other office. That will help you to manage that relationship.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Power dynamics are complicated, and when someone feels like perhaps their livelihood is at stake by calling something out, they will most likely behave differently in that scenario. And so it's really about assessing, your comfort level, as Jesse said, with your supervisor or the person who are having the power dynamic, thinking about getting HR involved if that's necessary. Every situation is different. And so there's no blanket answer for everything, but certainly those situations can be different, and your reaction to them may be different based on what your relationship is with that person. with that. So that is definitely one that is important to understand. Can you give some examples of what to say to a branch member perceived to be not on board with doing this work?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Edwina, were you going to say something?
Yeah. Well, what I would do that would because that's the person that I really have to work with. That's where my work begins. And I guess I would, after having a one-on-one conversation, um, I would let them know that I'm there to support them. Um, I would probably recommend some books for them to read. There are many now. There are many books to read on accepting racism in our everyday lives. Um, it depends on the situation and depends on the person, but I would not let that person just go. I would just work with that person and just keep having the conversation. Just keep having the conversation.
I think asking questions too can be helpful to understand like what their perspective or hesitancy is, and that might help inform which resources or which books you might recommend. I think it can be certainly difficult, but as Edwina said, yeah, continuing to have the conversation, whether they want to learn or are ready to learn, might take different amounts of time for different people.
And it's not always because they don't think that change is needed, or but a lot of people sometimes get satisfied that they're non-racist, but that's not enough anymore. You have to be anti-racist. So you want to keep driving that home.
Absolutely. It's a really important point. We do have a question here about sort of coordinating chapters, or they use the word chapters, obviously we talk about branches, to seek opportunities to sort of talk with one another. And I would say definitely have a conversation with your state leadership if you have state leadership. If you don't, it's easy on the website to figure out how many branches are in your state and sort of connect with those folks, because you may be able to do some common programming with them. A lot of states are coordinating their diversity, equity, and inclusion work, or at least getting started with that. This is a great time to start thinking about what those programs might be. I know a lot of folks are going to be doing their planning over the summer, their leadership conferences. So a really good time to sort of take stock of what we have in the toolkit, the webinars we've already done, and what you could sort of plan for programming. But really would encourage you to, if you're interested in sort of expanding that, your reach a little bit beyond your immediate branch. I think that's a good idea. I do think, though, there's a lot of work to be done within each individual branch as well, and those conversations can be useful, and maybe in some ways a little bit easier for folks if they know the people a little bit better and are more comfortable having those conversations with folks they've known for quite some time. All right, well, we are about out of time. It's almost 5 o'clock, and I don't want to keep folks any later. Are there any final words, Jesse or Edwina, that you'd like to share with the group?
I would just like to share with the group, get to know your members. It's very important to know your branch members.
Absolutely.
I would absolutely echo that. And I just wanted to say thank you to Edwina for joining us, because I emailed her and asked, and she was more than happy to join in. And I'm so glad that she was able to share her experience with us.
You're very welcome.
Yes, well, I want to thank both of you for today's session. It was a really great conversation, and I think we've given folks a lot of ideas, hopefully, and some tools that they can take back to their branches to really start some of these conversations. And we would absolutely recommend that you look at the content in the toolkit. There's a lot of great stuff there, and it can help further your thinking on these conversations. There's also some resources that you could give to some people to start having these conversations, as we've talked about a bit. So just a few wrap-up items. You're going to be getting a post-webinar survey in a few days, so please do take a few moments to fill that out. That definitely helps us in future webinars as well. And if you're interested in these topics, there are a couple of webinars that we've already done on this that are located on the AAUW website that you can access. All of our webinars are there for everyone to look at. And the next webinar on diversity, equity, and inclusion will be on June 10th at 4 p.m. Eastern. You have not received a link to sign up for that yet because we haven't sent it out yet because it's in June. But please do mark your calendar for that. That session will be on the basics of diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of definitions and the resources that we have. So would be a great follow-up to the conversation today, particularly on those key concepts and terms. And again, will definitely be helpful if you're thinking about doing programming on these topics for next year. So please do join us then. And thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.